Welcome to Mixed Mental Arts. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, we have Adam Hansen, who has written a book called Outsmart Your Instincts. And can you tell us a little bit first, Adam, about what your background is and sort of how you came to this whole situation?
Yeah, you bet. I was really lucky to figure out really early on that I could spend an entire career in innovation. And the moment that became obvious, it was a real clarifying moment. It was one of those light bulb moments. So I thought, if you really could do that, it didn't seem plausible to me for a moment. But when the case was made, I thought, well, hey, if someone could do that, why wouldn't you? And so this was in grad school. I was lucky then to spend the first half of my career on the client side working in innovation. Lastly, on the client side, I was innovation director at Mars, the candy company. That's what brought us to New Jersey. And then I met the company I'm with now, a consulting company, and I've now been with Ideas to Go for 16 years. And so innovation has been it. I figured out early on that anything else in marketing wasn't quite as interesting as innovation to me. So in that time, I've been able to work with, I haven't tallied it up, but it's probably approaching 200, different companies, working at the very front end of innovation.
And there's a sorry to interrupt, but there's it seems to me, because you touch on a lot of the things in the book that we talk about all the time. How feelings control. Should I be looking over here? Okay, so how feelings control your thinking. Our things like our confirmation biases. I think you have this chapter called
negativity bias.
Negativity bias. All these things Jonathan Haidt talks about. And there seems now more and more to be a language and a real body of measurable data that is getting us closer to understanding how we think, especially when we sit in front of a blank page. I mean, I make my living this way, right? I've got to come up with new ideas all the time. Otherwise, I'm done. And I think, so I'm fascinated with this whole idea. And I'm also fascinated with how my mind works. And you touch on a lot of this stuff. So are you drawing in this book? Have you had to study a lot of people like Jonathan Haidt and Daniel Kahneman and all these guys? Is this where you're drawing a lot of your information from? Obviously, also from your experience.
Well, yeah. So what happened about a little over 10 years ago, it became really clear to me. I'm kind of a nerd, and so I really started to become fascinated with what was going on in behavioral science. And I saw these really obvious parallels with what was coming out there with regard to these cognitive biases and what we were seeing in our work, and how clear it was that certain cognitive biases were really making innovation unnecessarily difficult. And most of us in our company most of us, all of us, really love innovation. And we want innovation to be this great experience that it really should be. If you're not having fun in innovation, you're doing something wrong. And so let's get some of these non-conscious biases out of the way so you can really get at it, because then some real fights still have to be waged. And if you can get the unnecessary stuff out of the way, all that baggage just really isn't doing anything.
For example, and baggage being something, for example, like this sort of tendency to be safe and to want to hold on to what you already know, as an example, right? Or
precisely.
Yeah, or my idea can't be very good because I'm me, that kind of stuff, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, that's what's funny about negativity bias, is that it's really interesting to conceive of it coming from other people. But then ultimately what we have seen is that we don't practice negativity bias on anyone else more than on ourselves. And
we have a governor, yeah.
Yeah. If we can just play with the ideas early on, we're not committing to anything yet. And so that's why I love the process that comedians go through of working small clubs first to test stuff out. Yeah. It's prototype culture. And so you're playing with stuff. And the more you can see ideas early on, not necessarily as end destinations in and of themselves, but as vehicles to get you to yet better places, then you can start locking them down once you have gone through that process.
And don't you have to kind of, I'm sorry, finish that thought. I'm sorry.
No, but it's, sometimes in the rush to get to the end destination, we forego so much great stuff. We leave so much value on the table. We leave so much really great unexplored territory behind us. And if we could just play with it a little more and not be so fixated on getting to that end thing, then we would actually come up with much better stuff.
Yeah, I call that asking the next question. So what'll happen a lot of times is you'll get this initial idea, and I notice with comics, they stop there. They stop at the first sort of idea. So what happens is that idea can tend to be somewhat derivative, or it can tend to be not fully fleshed out. What you're doing is touching on the surface. And I always say that when you get this spark, this idea of what something could be, what I do is I just keep returning to it every day in a gentle manner. So when I'm walking my dog or whatever it is, I just keep, so almost like I think of myself as a radio antenna, and I'm just going to keep channeling whatever comes through me and try to get everything out of the way. So no judgment yet. Let's just play and let's just explore. Is that sort of a better way of? I mean, that's
lovely, and you used a really great word, and so be conscious of judgment and hold off on it. We're not so interested early on in judgment. Lord knows that's going to come at some point, because that's just how we're wired. But if we can forestall judgment and be more interested in movement, that's much more important.
That's interesting. Movement. And don't you think also, though, Adam, that I noticed that we all do this, and I had to struggle against this. I could not believe when I was 24, 25, that I was even capable of being creative. Like, I didn't think that was for me. I didn't think that I was I really didn't think I was a creative person. I didn't, in fact, the other day I thought about this at 49, and there was a big comedian, and he said to me something to the effect of, man, that idea was so, you came up with this, where'd you come up with that idea? I said, well, my whole job is, all I care about is being original. It's what keeps me up at night. He said, dude, that was that idea. And I thought to myself, if I had looked back on this, I never thought I would have arrived at something like that, but I've long ago had to give myself permission. I had to kind of define myself as a creative person, which I never did. And so much of it is, I think many of us walk around saying, I'm not a creative person. That guy's a creative. I'm this kind of guy, right? So a lot of it's like giving yourself permission, or even defining yourself, or allowing yourself to dream about the fact that maybe you are creative. I had to go through that for a long time.
And what's so nuts about this is you go back to the research, and you ask kids, so kindergartners up through about third grade, how many of you are creative? Pretty much all the hands go up.
Wow.
You get up to about fifth grade, sixth grade, then you start to see some separation. Getting through middle school, further. By the time they're into high school, very few kids see themselves as creative. So some really weird messaging is coming in through the culture. Either there's a maladaptive definition of what creative is, or something, so that's happening. And maybe being creative is seen as it's just too narrow.
Yeah,
something.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Well,
but we are fundamentally, our species is, in addition to being Homo sapiens, a creative ape, we also just could have been called the creative ape. And that is true to what we are. We do things, some of the things that separate us cognitively from the other primates, we also separate creatively. We do a lot of things that aren't just tied to knowing and cognition, but are directly tied to creativity, separate from cognition.
Yeah, Yuval Harari, in his book Sapiens, which is a really good book, he talks about how our foraging hunter-gatherer ancestors were very creative because they had to be. They had to be very, very innovative about first of all, they had to be very aware of all kinds of noises and all kinds of smells and all kinds of, sights, and, because there was so much danger, but you also had to know plants. You had to know when to eat those plants. You had to know how to track animals. You had to understand their basic behavior. There were so many things that their brains were occupied with. So the idea that as we developed agriculture and cities and literature became smarter, or our brains became more, not necessarily. In fact, maybe and especially the way we school our children, maybe we became a little bit more rigid in our thinking and less creative because we were able to find, there were clearer paths to getting safe and to getting food.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's an interesting theory.
Yeah. Well, in the two great drives, we're interested in both prospect and refuge. And that's why we're drawn to landscapes always that show, a lot of green, a lot of water, but then some indication that, oh, look at that light. There's a path over there. Ooh, wouldn't that be kind of cool to go explore? If all these landscapes only showed refuge, well, that's kind of boring. But if the landscapes also only showed prospect and no refuge, that would be kind of stress-inducing because we wouldn't have any sense of a safe space. So we really do want those two things, both prospect and refuge. And our whole species, history has been the story of trying to balance those two things out.
That's so interesting that you say that. That's fascinating. I've never heard anybody break those two down because I went hunting in Alaska in the middle of nowhere. We had to take a seaplane, and every one of us, we were out there in the middle of nowhere, and every one of us, there was no refuge. And so all of us kept talking about how sad it made us feel. How we were all kind of stressed, in fact, about that. That's so interesting because all of us were like looking at this. Oh, sure, it's beautiful. It does not give a shit about you. You're in the middle of nowhere, man, and there's nowhere to go. It's like I'm up, and even the animals were like, "It's way too high. Fuck this place. We're going down." And we couldn't find any animals. And it was so interesting because all of us had a deep sense of almost sadness. We got depressed at looking at this insanely beautiful landscape, but again, like you said, that must have been what it was. There was no refuge. It was just prospect, man.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you need to have both.
Yeah. So tell us the first thing that you find or the most common thing, because Hunter and I have talked and touched on a lot of this with Jonathan Haidt and stuff like that. I was listening to Jonathan Haidt talk yesterday about how the first thing we do is we say, if there's something that we already have, so if there's a study that says coffee gives you breast cancer, the women are that love coffee are gonna try to find flaws in that study, right? And the ones who don't drink coffee are gonna be like, oh, that's interesting. So we tend to try to say to ourselves, can I believe this? Must I believe this? And then if you really want to believe something, you go, let me look for the data to see if I can believe this. I want to believe this. So that would be confirmation bias. So what do you find to be the number one sort of thing that somebody has to get out of their brain, or at least the habit that one has to kind of lose in order to begin this sort of process of being innovative?
Well, it's not an accident that the first bias that we go into, so we identify 8 of the cognitive biases that are tripping us up for innovation. And it's not an accident the first one we go into is negativity bias. This whole, yes, but. This reflects...
Yes, but. Yes, but? Is that what you said?
The whole yes, but, yeah. And the research is really compelling on it because, well, first of all the cognitive biases are non-conscious and reflexive, right? We just do them. They served our ancestors really, really well. So they were adaptive at certain points in our history. I mean, they are why we're still alive now. And when you think about negativity bias in particular, so, Og and Thrak are out, wandering, close to the clan HQ, but you hear the rustle in the bushes. Og is really smart, so he just gets the hell out of there.
He's like, it's definitely a lion. Just to err on the side of caution, right? It's going to try to eat me.
So it's just a rustle in the bushes. He's not going to stop to ponder, hey, is that a distinct rustle? Is there something unique to that I ought to go, could that actually be prospect? Could that actually be new opportunity? Og gets out of there. Thrak goes, well, no, I haven't heard quite that sort of rustle before. So I'm going to hang here for just a moment and see if I can, collect some more data. Of course, he's not thinking quite that high-mindedly because, it's the Pleistocene era. But the moment that he doesn't place as much distance between him and the rustle in the bushes as Og did, his genetic fate takes probably a pretty good hit, right? Or at least, overall odds take a pretty good hit. So you repeat that over and over and over, and we are the descendants of the savants of risk aversion. So we come by this very honestly. And so negativity bias, bad is stronger than good. We know that negative people, events, and information will always loom much more largely in our cognition and in our emotions than their positive, counterparts.
I hope that people who are in human resources in the entire tech industry and everybody else, where they force you to go to negativity bias training, I hope that they understand that they're dealing with evolution. So human beings, we tend to react maybe a little bit in a negative manner when we see something new. It doesn't mean we're prejudiced or racist. It just means we're like, hey man, that's something new. I haven't seen that before. Good luck trying to change that, everybody. But keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, we're talking about, the echoes of thousands of generations here.
Yeah.
So the idea that we're going to, expunge that in a training session is
hilarious.
The best a training session can do is bring some awareness to it. So then with that, and hopefully we have some colleagues that, we're in it together. Hopefully it brings about a little bit of humility.
Yeah, that's
and
fair.
some awareness that's there. And then you can start to do something about it. But it's, Daniel Kahneman is not very optimistic that we're going to cure any of the cognitive biases. The best we can do is be aware of them.
And he won a Nobel Prize, but what does he know?
Well, but it's also you can't cure human hardware, right? And that's the big mistake I think that people always make is that they're like, oh, human hardware should be different, as opposed to designing around human hardware as it is. And we don't go around.
We're doing more than that. We're punishing human hardware.
Yeah, exactly. We're punishing people for being human. And, that's so much of the problem of education is that, what's happening is that why is there that stripping out where you have the kids who think they're creative and then by the high school, they've gotten this message that they're not. It's because, you're trying to play, you're trying to explore, you're essentially trying to start that beginning of the creative process, and then you're being told not to do that. And that you're being disruptive and all of that. And so that process is shut down for people, and you don't realize that what you're doing is you're shutting down human creativity. You're shutting down humanity.
I had an acting teacher who used to always say, I hate parents. And we'd say, what do you mean? He goes, I got to undo all the work they did. He would always find somebody, usually a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and they would probably come from money, and they'd be very good looking, and he would look at them and say, oh boy, and they'd say, what? And he said, you were told to shh a whole bunch as a kid, weren't you? And well, I mean, you have to be polite. He said, yeah, I know, in this class you need to unlearn that bullshit, and I need to make an asshole of yourself with alarming regularity if you want to be an actor. And so you'd have to kind of get back to your child, and and he'd make you do these exercises. But by the way, that acting teacher was Jeffrey Tambor, who stars in Transparent, Emmy Award winning.
Oh, lovely.
Amazing actor.
Yeah.
But I mean, and he was right. You so much of which got in the way of being an actor, which is being in touch with your emotions and being able to feel and respond honestly, which is part of the creative process, is really schooled out of us. I mean, and it makes sense. You can't really have a society where people are throwing themselves to the ground and freaking out because you don't have their waffles that morning. I mean, that'd be weird, at the Google cafeteria. But
that's right.
But it also it doesn't make sense. I think that's the thing is that these are old sort of Victorian notions about decorum and order, and those were the priorities of those societies. Now, if you don't know how to innovate, then you die, right? I mean, this is
and so that's kind of the thesis of the book is what served us so well back then, and maybe even more recently, and even in certain circumstances now can still maybe be helpful. I mean, now if we hear a rustle in the bushes, it's probably still a really great idea to get out of there, right? We're out here in the wilds of Northwest New Jersey. We get bears in our garage every now and again. We know, but we just need to be conscious of this stuff. So then we can be wise about and we can choose what our response is.
Just saying that, Adam, is huge, because knowing how your brain works, now you can sort of, when you go to create something, you can get that guy out of the way, because that all the first thing you do is you go, no, not me, or I can't, I'm not a creative person. Well, get that, that at least we know that is a natural sort of wall we have to climb if we're on our way.
That's right.
And what's the next wall?
You can almost go, oh, okay, check. I'm doing that. I expected I was going to do that. So now I did that. That's done.
Exactly. What's the next wall? Bring us through these 8 cognitive steps. I love it.
So then we have availability bias, which is the idea that we don't make decisions necessarily on what would be most helpful to have in our head, but what we can most quickly summon, or what we think is most just in the moment. We can just place our hands on it most quickly. It might be one of the more recent things that happened to us or whatever. And that is rarely the most helpful or the most representative examples of whatever this thing is that we're thinking about. And so we just need to be able to take a moment, and goodness gracious, today with the internet, with Google, with the availability of so much information, it really doesn't take that long just to get some additional information in to balance that kind of quick, reflexive, again, hunt for, relevant data.
And a good example of sort of how these cognitive biases can work together is the availability bias plus the Dunbar number leads to dumbbarring, right? So this is this is a term that Adam came up with for mixed mental arts. So yeah, tell us about dumbbarring.
Well, so the Dunbar number is that we can't help but be reductive in how we assess groups that we're not familiar with. And so we will, the moment we find one example of a group, that now is our proxy for the group. And just being aware that that is probably not going to be representative is helpful. When we think that has captured kind of the extent and essence of all the members of that group, then that really is kind of dumb. And particularly when that first example is brought to us by a media that has a vested interest in kind of, getting clicks.
Disaster porn.
Right. So that's just kind of a riff off Dunbar and calling it Dumbar.
So
I love that.
Yeah. So an example is like, if your only exposure to Arabs is ISIS, then you're like, man, Arabs are crazy. And the point is, no, ISIS is crazy, and the majority of Arabs are not like ISIS.
My favorite is whenever I hear people who are, educated and intelligent, and having grown up in the Arab world for 8 years of my life, I'll hear them say things like, they don't treat human life, they don't respect human life the way we do over here. Human life is cheap over there. It's just cheap. Oh, is it really? Is that right? You think human beings it's fine to die? Yeah, my dad died and my kid died, but that's human.
What's that based on?
Yeah, well, we have evolved to, we have broken up. It's very easy for human beings. We are tribal apes. We're bipolar apes, and we're also apes that break people into us versus them. We've had to. It goes back to the Dunbar number in some ways, in that you can only keep 150 people in your brain at one time. And you almost have to lump people into groups. And Hunter always says that's inevitable, but you want to be able to stereotype better than you do.
That's right.
Right? And you don't want to fall for, and as you learn more from, like your book does a great job of this, as you learn more about how your brain works, you'll be able to check yourself before you start to stereotype in a very typical human evolutionary way. Because a lot of this, I mean, Adam, your book is important because a lot of this is kind of outsmarting your instincts, outsmarting your evolution, right? I mean, being aware of how you've evolved and realizing that the way you have evolved may not be very good for the 21st century economy if you want to be innovative, which really means if you want to succeed.
That's the idea. And the great news about our mind is that we do have this capability of self-awareness. And so we can, and with all this great research, again, with the breakthroughs in behavioral science, we really have learned more about how we actually think and behave in the last 30 years than we had in the previous 300. Mm. And, for years, you just kind of, the mind is a black box. We're going to see what we can do, but, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. We do know more. Now, we still ought to be humble on that, and great. And we know we're going to continue to learn a whole lot more. But we ought to take the research that is there. And what's wonderful about mixed mental arts is taking the research and actually making it relevant and applicable to normal people like us. And that's what we're trying to do with Outsmart Your Instincts. That's what I loved about what was going on with, the Brian Callen show, now Mixed Metal Arts. This idea that all these ideas don't have to be cloistered.
Right.
I mean, the stuff really can and should matter for normal people. And that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, it makes it accessible. That your book really does a good job of that too. I think it's very important because, again, so many people think that this kind of thinking, this kind of understanding belongs to those people over there, the cognitive elite or whoever they might be. And when you start to realize that these ideas are accessible, and maybe it starts with understanding how your brain works, that would be, okay, so we are at, so keep going with we're at, what is the third obstacle here?
Okay, I'll pick it up a little here. So the third one is the curse of knowledge.
You don't have to pick it up. This is fascinating.
Yeah, the curse of knowledge is the idea that once we're expert in something, we think we can place ourselves back at square one, back at that position of knowing nothing about it. And our version of dumbing things down is still kind of like the 401 or the 501 level. But we're so far past even that dumbed down still assumes away so much knowledge that there can still be this huge barrier between us and the totally naive to our topic. And so there, again, with all of these, we show not just what it is, what it looks like when you confront it, but importantly, how you can overcome it. And the secret is that how you overcome it really isn't that difficult. And that's what we really want to make obvious to everyone is this is not a black box. This is so doable. And so with the curse of knowledge, it's just really kind of taking that step back and really observing now as the expert what is really going on with the naive.
Well, explain. Really, I'm a little confused. So the naive within yourself or the naive with people who you're trying to convince? What do you mean?
The people you're trying to communicate with.
Right. So in other words, if I've been boxing since I was 7 years old, I'm going to skip steps about footwork that, it's so instinctual for me that, basically I'm going to be starting at 5 where I'm going to be at, wait a minute, how are you catching those angles? I don't know what your feet are doing. Is that sort of the idea?
That's right. It's been so long since you've had to think about the very most rudimentary parts of that you can't even remember having to go through it.
Yeah.
And so having to take a step back as an expert and go, wait, I have to break down now even the simplest parts of this because I was really at one point there, and even the very easiest parts of this were difficult for me at one point.
That makes a lot of sense. That's actually why when you are learning a new skill, whether it's, I'm just using sports as an example, I like to box. If you're learning from somebody who is a world champion versus somebody who wasn't that good but had to work on fundamentals, it makes a big difference. That's why Freddie Roach was so good. Freddie Roach got hit a lot, and he wasn't a great boxer, but he was good, but he knows how to make champions. You see that with a lot of great trainers in boxing. They were not the best boxers at all, but man, they understand fundamentals, and those are the coaches you want, and those are their fighters win.
And that's sort of an inversion of the usual those who can't teach thing, because usually those
Look at Maradona. Maradona was teaching. What was he in charge of Argentina's soccer league? And the greatest soccer player of all time, Maradona was. I like to roll my R's when I say his name, Maradona. But he just. There's no way that guy was going to beat the Germans. There's no way. There was just too much fire and finesse and beauty. And the Germans were like, yeah, cool, dude. Really nice footwork. We're a juggernaut. We're going to do something called pass the ball in a very methodical way. We'll see you later after we beat you 6-0. But thanks a lot for the dance. It's really true. They did the same thing to the Brazilians. I mean, this is why I love this kind of stuff. I love this because that's a really important point. Is your knowledge can really cause you to step ahead. But how does that affect the person who's actually trying to innovate? Or you're kind of teaching. You're talking about if you want to teach. You want to create an innovative team. Is that what you're saying?
Well. Now whenever you're innovating, you have an audience.
Okay.
I mean, you have people you want to buy your product or your service or your act if you're a comedian or whatever. you need to be able to get back into their shoes somehow. You need to be able to see what you're offering through their eyes. And if you're now so expert that you just can't even get back to what those beginning faltering steps to understand your subject, what that may really feel like and really look like, then that's a problem. That's a barrier. That's what the curse of knowledge is all about.
And a great example of that is all these academic books. I mean, I said this to Adam before, but Richard Nisbett has that great book. I think it's Mindware. And Mind Tools, yeah, which is a lot of it is about, it's similar content. It's about these cognitive biases, but it's written by an academic who understands this stuff so well that Mind Tools ends up being this exhaustive list of so many cognitive biases. It's really in depth, and it's very hard to, like, even I, who have read so much of this science and have bathed in this stuff, I read Mind Tools and I was overwhelmed. Wow. Because I was like, this is way too much. I don't understand how I would apply this. I don't know how I would use this. So for someone who's never had any exposure to these ideas, I can only imagine. And Adam's book is much better because it takes 8 things. It works you through them. It doesn't stay limited to sort of academic terminology, right? Because academics have these terrible terms like heuristics. And, he really breaks these things down. He creates characters like Og and Thrak that makes things accessible and relatable. Yeah. So I think that's in essence, mixed mental arts is if it's responsive to any one of these cognitive biases, it's really the curse of knowledge that we're trying to solve, where you have all these experts who know the material in their little field so well that they've forgotten how to communicate it to people who have day jobs.
And to piggyback on this, and I don't know if this fits into this particular, the curse of knowledge, but one thing that you see with comics and with writers is that, and I know plenty of them who are pretty successful, but one of the biggest obstacles for them is they find that they are sort of caught up on the same question. The writers, comedians can find a lot of success in the beginning, the first half of their careers or whatever it might be, in sort of exploring and obsessing over one question. What is a man? What is bravery? Whatever it might be. And
anybody specific you're talking about here, Brian?
Exactly. But then what actually happens is you realize that you've exhausted that, or you're repeating yourself, and it's a very scary time because you have to throw a lot of that stuff out, and you've got to almost put those things to bed. Because a lot of times, I don't know if they're trauma, whatever they are, but you've got to make peace with that side of yourself if you are going to continue to be creative and come up with a fresh point of view. And let me tell you, when you've built a foundation on one particular thing and one particular kind of comedy, and now you've got to change course and be just as innovative, it's daunting, but let me tell you, the things you touch on must be confronted, and they're very helpful. They're very, very helpful. So,
well, thanks.
Yeah.
Well,
helped me anyway.
It was fun. It was really fun putting it together. And as we were going through it, we really did make an attempt to make it super accessible. Part of this was really easy because English isn't my first language. Because
it's not?
I'm from Idaho. So there you go.
That's right.
I shouldn't try comedy in front of a comedian.
No, it was funny. It made me laugh. Come on, it was good.
Yeah.
So the curse of knowledge. Next obstacle.
Next one, status quo bias. And people sometimes ask us. So status quo bias is the idea that in any course of action, there is always one alternative, which is to do nothing new. Right? You could always shoot, hey, we have 2 new alternatives here, A or B. Well, there's always the other alternative, C, which is just stay where you are. And we are hardwired to prefer C, stay just where you are. And some people ask us sometimes, well, how is that different than negativity bias? They are both rooted in loss aversion. We really just, hey, what we have is really wonderful. But the fix for the two is different enough that we saw some real value in putting some daylight between them. So with status quo bias, just simply understanding that we also have this kind of this conservatism not to branch out. and just to stay at home base. That is a little bit different than just saying, finding the negative in everything. That's just, I want to be safe. This really is refuge, right? But the fix for it is when we're considering alternatives, we will subject all these alternatives to some real scrutiny, and we'll just beat up the alternatives, but we'll rarely subject the status quo to that same kind of scrutiny, right? And if we can just turn the lens in back on the status quo and say, well, hey, if we were thinking about where we are as critically, would we still choose it? And the answer is often, well, maybe not. And so that's really a fairly simple thing to just kind of put into our repertoire.
I heard Tony Robbins talk about this. He seems to know a lot about how the brain works. I don't like this sort of, he was teaching about wealth, and I've always been suspect of anybody who's like, you got to condition yourself for wealth, and okay, well, fine. But he did say something interesting, which was that a lot of our thoughts about money, so if I'm going to go make money, or if again, let me go back to acting. I might acting teacher said, being a star is easy. It's easy. Well, what do you mean being a star is easy? This business, he goes, it's getting out of your own way that's hard, right? You guys do 15 things. He had this girl, she was there crying. Her career wasn't going well. And he isolated 15 different things she was doing to ensure her failure. The money is the same thing. If you hear these gurus, they'll say things like, money is the root of all evil. What if will I have time to spend it? Will I have time for my friends? There are so many negative connotations to money, right? There are just so many, money can't make you happy. Money doesn't buy you happiness. Money is, so he was like, you got to get, first of all, a good idea would be to get all of that sort of bias out of the way. That sort of, you're coming up with reasons not to make money to begin with.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to get out of your way. And so get that shit out of the way, get these negative connotations toward money, and then it'll probably free you up to sort of start thinking about how to make money. It was an interesting way of looking at it, so.
Well, so even in that example, people aren't looking at their status quo nearly as critically as they are that would-be future. Mm-hmm. And so that's weird, mm-hmm. right? So it's really easy to poke holes in this alternative. Yeah. But then we'll never then go, okay, well, let's now line up 5 things about the current situation that maybe aren't quite as wonderful. And then now I can assess that maybe a little more fairly, because now I'm stacking the deck, because I'm just assuming away the given, the status quo, and I'm just not thinking about it at all. And the incumbent situation will always have an advantage, always, always, always. And so you just need to be fair about it and not stack the deck against these alternatives. And so that's just
they break this down into conservative liberals too. A lot of times conservatives tend to have a personality that kind of wants to keep things, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Let's keep these foundations and these institutions that have been around for a long time. And let's be very careful about changing anything. And then you have sort of a liberal mindset that tends to want to, on the extremes on both ends, but, this is kind of where a lot of this comes from. This is, literally, I was thinking about these Charlottesville marchers. Yes, some of them are Nazi saluting, and that's the lunatic fringe. But if you hear them talk, they're trying to ruin our way of life. This is the white Christian way of life. It's given us all this stuff, and you guys are trying to destroy it. And what happens to me? A lot of it, as you learn how the brain works, is it's not even racist. This is people not even aware of how their own brains are working. They are basically afraid, and they are going into status quo. Is it status quo bias? Yeah. They're going into these very predictable human patterns. Now, they're also touting guns and toting guns, and they're wearing symbols. But again, this is pretty predictable. It's predictable.
They're absolutely.
You can see that there are fringes of society that are going to do this, and you have the left that wants to, the far left that wants to not just improve. They want to change. They want to burn things down. And they want to, that's the revolution. I want to burn this shit down and build it up from scratch, because apparently everything before me sucks, and I'm going to revolutionize everything with my binary thinking. Oppressors oppressed. It's the same, it's Marxism.
Or gender non-binary thinking.
Sure, whatever it is. But again, I mean, this is why your work is so important, and you're drawing on work before you that's and putting it all together, because it's very important. The more we learn about how our brains work, two things will happen. One, we'll be able to check ourselves, and two, we'll probably have a little more compassion and understanding for not only how people are behaving, but maybe we'll have a better understanding of how to talk to them and change their minds. God, I'm so smart. You see how I put
Brian, that was inspirational.
Wow, I wish there was music. Next time I want you to hum the
there
Rocky
will be.
theme.
That's the benefit of having Reed
Yes!
here.
There we are.
He's gonna edit in some
and that's what we're trying to get to here is, you know, regardless of political bent, what we really want to start looking at is, are people avoiding merely being reflexive? And feel the feelings, that's great, because we are human. We are going to do that. The idea that, you know, we can somehow get past that is just silly.
Your fast thinking is going to happen.
The feelings, the amygdala is a great counselor. It shouldn't be driving the bus, right? And so go ahead and feel the feelings, but then pause, reflect, and now let the prefrontal cortex back in and make some decisions. And so that's what's going to be interesting. And I think the opportunity for us as a society is really not so much about left or right, but it's to get past limbic politics and get more into whole brain politics, where we can have those intuitions, we can have those feelings, but the discussion doesn't just end there, which too often is just ending there. And so that's why it's not going anywhere. And so, yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, that's, Adam was at the Columbus meetup for Mixed Mental Arts, and then he was at the New York meetup for Mixed Mental Arts.
Jeez, Adam.
And, he's been very active in the Mixed Mental Arts Facebook group.
We love having you, man.
Yeah. And
it's a blast, man. This is just this is more fun than a barrel full of poorly socialized monkeys.
Well, I just am so it's so exciting to have people like you who are thinking, and not only that, organizing your thoughts and putting them into a book like this, and then you're a part of this community, man. That's what makes the difference. It really is, because the book is accessible. This is so accessible. Like, this is the kind of thing where I can go to people. If I tell people to read Thinking Fast and Slow, this stuff it's a dense book. It's great, but it's not it's just way easier and the title is way better too. Outsmart Your Instincts. Yeah, there you go. Try this. Well,
thank you.
Yeah. So keep going. I'm sorry that we're breaking the book down, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't read the book, because the book is fascinating. But I just want to get I want you to, from your, so we've got status quo bias. What else?
Confabulation, and this one is really fun and weird. And this probably as good as any of the cognitive biases really shows how strange we are. And this is the idea that we think that we can explain why we do what we do, but often we really can't, because we don't have access to what those motivations are. And so if we do something and someone asks us, well, why did you do that? We'll come up with a plausible story that isn't lying. We're not being dishonest. We're not trying to, well, hopefully we're not. I mean, we're going to go with the assumption of, good faith and ethical people here. But we simply don't have access to those non-conscious emotional motivations. So we will come up with something that seems to make sense, but it's not really quite it. And the story that we lead off with, I just want to tell you quickly, because it's such a great one. And then the difference between this story and us is only a difference of degree, not of kind. And so this gentleman, David McLean, wakes up standing on a train platform in the heat of India and realizes he doesn't know who he is, which is kind of a dilemma, because it's India and it's hot. And he's discombobulated. A transit policeman comes up to him, seeing his situation. He's all now kind of disheveled and everything. They start talking, and he tells the cop, hey, I've got a problem here. I don't know who I am. Evidently, he didn't have any, ID on him or anything. And the transit cop says, oh, well, you're a drug addict, because most Americans in that situation there, in that, that's what's going on. And so he's actually relieved now to have some identity that he can start to build around. And his mind starts furnishing him all these details of his newfound identity as drug addict. And he pieces together, as they're on their way to the police station, he sees a place and goes, oh, that's my flop house. And in his mind, he puts together this story of his red-haired girlfriend, Christina, with whom he shoots up. And he has all these kind of sense impressions and all. He pulls together all this really rich, detailed story of him as drug addict.
Wow.
And, over the course of a couple days, they actually do some good sleuthing and figure out that, well, no, his name is David McLean, and he's actually a writer on fellowship with the U.S. government. And what he's experiencing is actually a fairly common symptom of the malarial vaccine that he took, to be there in India.
Wow.
And so now that's a very extreme example of confabulation.
Get back to
but
the
again,
redhead, though. Sorry.
What we do is only different in degree, not in kind. So he had all those memories somewhere in his brain. And once he just had that little germ to build around, boom, the story came together.
This is in Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens Again. He talks about how the idea that, our system of government, which is based on, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We have certain unalienable rights. And that is what we base our government on. It's something we all believe in. Everybody is of the same moral worth. That's how you are looked at in the eyes of our law. Liberalism is really a new religion. I mean, and we all kind of adhere to this. Most of us, anyway. Your skin color doesn't make any difference, and all these things. But if you think about the way democracy works, it isn't biologically necessarily. It isn't necessarily, biologically true in that the idea that we have unalienable rights. Well, no, not necessarily in nature, right? So in other words, there is this idea that he kind of says it might be better that we've evolved differently. We have evolved differently, and we have certain mutable characteristics that are good and bad. And he goes on to talk about sort of what we've come out, what we are biologically, what we are in an evolutionary sense. And it actually has very little to do with the way we have structured this wonderful government of ours. I'm a big believer in the Constitution and what the Founding Fathers stood for, etc. But it's still a story. And it is actually confabulation. Is that the word you used?
Yeah.
It's a confabulation. It's a collective confabulation. It's a collective story we've all agreed upon, and because it actually works to a large extent. There are problems, but we do this as a society. As you were talking about this, we kind of create a big story. We all agree upon it, and it's how we structure our society. And so many societies did the opposite of that. So, in ancient Babylon, he kind of draws the differences. There were, the king is at the top, and, there are certain people that are born lucky and other people that are not born, and there are slaves, and slaves are morally closer to the ground. And there's just different ways to tell yourself a story, and societies have done it forever, and it's how they've organized things. So...
Well, that's true. And the fact is, we can't avoid doing this. We are meaning-seeking animals, right? We need to have meaning to make things work for us. And so the idea is just like with all the other cognitive biases, to be aware of it so that we can, over time, maybe try to get a little bit better at it and just try to... Again, just by understanding that it's going on, that will be helpful.
Well, and this is where the scientific method comes in, because the point is these confabulations or these stories or stories you've made up, You remember that they're stories you've made up, and then you can ask yourself, what am I really basing this story on? Like, what is the data that it's grounded in? And so for David McLean, it's like, oh, wait, this is all based on the fact that I knew nothing except for this one thing this cop told me. And then I built on that and had this elaborate thing. So it's not grounded in much. And it's the same thing with Dunbaring, right? So I have this idea that, you know, Arabs don't value life and that, you know, everyone's a crazy terrorist. What is this based on? Oh, it's only based on news reports. Oh, news reports are trying to grab my attention with shark attacks. So essentially, these are the shark attacks of geopolitics. But it doesn't mean that it's not safe to go in the water. It just means that they've exaggerated the most scary thing they can think of to try and essentially generate clickbait.
Hmm.
Hey, my apologies. Can I take a short pause?
Sure.
My iPad is drawing down power unnecessarily quickly.
No problem.
I just need to get a quick plug.
Go ahead.
I'll be right back.
Perfect.
I'm gonna go pee out of my huge dick.
Jesus, Brian, are you sure that the bathroom can fit your dick?
This is great. This podcast is fantastic.
Well, thank you. Come on. This is great.
Yeah.
Well, listen, man, it's fun to talk about this stuff, and that took a lot of effort. That took a lot of effort to write a book like this. I mean, you know.
Oh, it was fun.
Yeah.
It was a blast.
Well, it's an important book, though. It's all this stuff is so important, man.
And I think I think part of the reason why Adam resonated so much with what we're doing and we resonate so much with what he's been doing is because we're on parallel tracks. Because, you know, Brian, after we did the Belt podcast, he said, you know, in essence, mixed martial arts comes down to 3 words. So can you. And that is really the point is that, you know, innovation seems like this thing that is magical. And that's how humanity always starts off. A thing seems like magic. Then there's science and we understand how it happens. And then it becomes engineering where we are consistently doing that thing. And it's now time for humanity to transition into consistently innovating and, you know, doing it in a reliable way. And Adam is here to help shaman humanity into that new phase, to midwife us in by breaking down.
There's an art to learning and there's an art to innovation. There's an art to it. There's an art to education. If you are given the broad context, so all of a sudden you start to see that educated people, academics, there's a certain language. They've schooled themselves in, there's a scaffolding all of them have, and there's a language they all speak. So they all know who the leaders of thought are in various, you know, subjects and what those rebuttals to those thoughts were, and then you can specialize. But when you realize that they have just kind of built this sort of scaffolding for themselves, you go, well, I see, you read that, you exposed yourself to that, and this was an idea that you kind of studied, but I can do that too. It's just time, right? I mean,
absolutely.
if you're anything like that, anything, and whether it's jujitsu or that's why I'm such a fan of systems. I love like boxing or jujitsu. There's a system to getting good at it. You can learn that language. You're not going to be a world champion, but you can learn the language so it's not so much of a mystery.
So my favorite professor in grad school was a German cat named Oliver Heil. And the first day of class, he said, "Hi, my name is Oliver. Please don't call me Dr. Heil or anything like that. I'm at the most 2 or 3 years older than some of you. And the only reason why I'm the professor and you're the student is that I read several more books than you and went to several more classes. That's it.
Yeah.
So let's get to work and let's figure this thing out." And he was just so approachable and he made the class so much fun.
Yeah.
That how could you not love the guy?
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, that's I always try to do that when I give advice to younger people. I always say, look, I'm not smarter than you are. And but I do, I've made way more mistakes. And and as a result, I'm a little better at pattern recognition in this context. I'm just able to see, I've been where you are, so I'm able to see where you're headed, and I think there's a wall over here, so I'm just going to get you to turn the wheel a little bit. That's all it is.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean
Perfect.
I'm smarter, man. And, unless it's an out of work actress and she really needs my help, I'm not going to tell her I'm really brilliant. Oh, sorry, my wife listens to this podcast, so I should. No, but that is a trap we also have to worry about to watch out for too. happy with who we've become. You know,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? It can be its own prison when, you're my age, and I guess you've been doing stand-up a long time, and somebody young says, hey, they say something nice to you. You can get real used to that. And in fact, you can sort of stop growing because it's kind of fun to be beyond the process of where you have to actually write or perform.
Well, so here's another bias we don't talk about, but Hunter and I were talking about it a while back, and that is, I don't know if you've heard of the Dunning-Kruger bias.
No.
But this is so I'll tell you about it quickly. At the low end, the Dunning-Kruger bias is what American Idol looked like the first couple weeks, where people are so unaware of what talent looks like that they come in and they think they're brilliant singers and they're horrible, right? Then so it's a mismatch between actual ability and demonstrated ability. At the high end, it's when you then become really good at something, but then you still know that there are people that are above you. Now you can, so you're on K2 now, but you're still not on Everest. And so you go, well, yeah, I'm okay, but I'm not on Everest yet.
Yes.
So I'm not really all that great. And you tend to dismiss all of your achievements really unfairly, really, really irrationally.
Because you're comparing as opposed to looking at where you've come, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I love people who suffer from that second one. I think being humble, even when you're up there, but not in kind of a smarmy, false humility way. You can always see through that. But what that tells to me, people who are still striving, who they're not satisfied yet. They love it. They still want to keep working at it. And that's what I think is beautiful.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm ever going to get, I will never get to Everest, but I'm going to keep trying.
None of us are really. I mean, where is Everest anyway? Look at Einstein. I was listening to this course called Redefining Reality and talk about a genius and a guy who kind of redefined how we think. But even he kept saying, I got to come up with this unification theory, or I got to, what else is there? And, he was probably racked with his own inadequacies. It's incredible, man.
Well, and that's, I think it's this is a lot of what Adam and I have talked about is that, it's what is the series, your experience is defined by what your emotions are. And, if you compare on one hand the experience of humility, curiosity, searching, you have that prospect, but you also have that refuge. And then on the other hand, you have arrogance, complacency, self-satisfaction. I think it's a much more pleasant way to live, to have that experience of being seeking, being curious, not knowing.
You'll learn that too, though, because like the minute you compete or put yourself in the arena, you're gonna learn where your level's at. Believe me. Like that's what Henso Gracie is a great jiu-jitsu teacher, and I used to train at his school in New York, and we'd get guys. I remember this guy came in who was he was like some big wrestler, like a really tough dude, man, and used to just dominating. And Henso kind of casually put him with a guy who was like a purple belt, he was kind of built like a CPA, but this guy didn't understand what jiu-jitsu was. He just knew he could grab you, take you down, throw you on your back, and punch you in the face. And this dude, his name was Alex, I remember, kind of a handsome kid, but quiet. And he was casually, like, how you stretch in bed? You kind of move like this. He was moving at that pace and just putting this guy in just terrible positions. And you'd see the guy, and the guy would get choked out and be like, and he'd go, fuck, and scream. And it was so inappropriate, but he was so mad. But it was the first time he was walking around thinking he was a silverback. And he left realizing he was a fucking baboon, man. He was not a silverback. It's the same idea as boxing. There was this guy who was a male stripper from Vegas, and he had a couple of pro fights. And he was in the gym, and he knocked two dudes out. And my teacher, Wayne McCulloch, he fought at 119. He walks around at about 135 pounds, but he was a world champion. And Wayne, and a silver medalist in the Olympics, he goes, hey, not in this. Don't do that here. You can't do that here. It's rude. And the guy knocked somebody else out. And so Wayne said, keep your headgear on. And he gets in there with just his mouthpiece and hit him so hard in the body and just dropped him to one knee. And the guy was going, hey, hey. And Wayne was like, well, that's the difference. That now you walk in thinking you're a tough guy. and I had to school you. And this is actually where your level's at. And so it's really important to put yourself in positions of like, it's very easy to cloister yourself around your students and you're never, you're never putting yourself out there with competition. So it's important to compete in one way or another,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Plus it makes it fun.
Yeah.
And to make these ideas compete. I mean, that's a great point. These ideas are great ideas, but they're not in a form that's competitive. And that's, what Outsmart Your Instincts is about. And in terms of a structured path, that's what the belt system is about. Reading broadly is about, right? I mean, I think what people often miss is specialization is just another word for narrow-mindedness. It's the same thing. And, a lot of these academics are extremely specialized, in other words, narrow-minded. And so on the one hand, there's a lot to learn from academics, but on the other hand, the whole point is that by being a mixed mental artist, you can actually become much smarter than a lot of these academics because, they know one thing.
Again, this is what we talked about fighting wise. You can be an amazing boxer, but if you're going to try to get in the ring with a guy who can kick and wrestle, he's going to take your weapon away from you real quick. So confabulation. We talked about the Kruger. Now what's the next obstacle?
The next one is conformity bias, and this one is fairly self-explanatory. We are social critters. We like to think we're proud individualists. And the influence of others on us is much stronger on us than we'd ever care to acknowledge. And so, it's in our hormonal response. We still, when we see disapproval of others, cortisol is immediately, injected into our system. And, our threat detection apparatus is blunt. It makes no distinction between, tiger and, Bob didn't like what I just said.
It's so true. Our biggest fear, Nietzsche said, our biggest fear is solitude, is being excluded.
Yeah. And I like to think that I'm pretty independent. And all of us very, somewhat in this. But even the most, fierce independent among us is still part of this. I mean, we are social critters. And the need for agreement prematurely has kept so many great innovations from happening. And you need to be very conscious about when agreement needs to happen and when agreement just isn't the right consideration. And in some of this discussion around it, when I've talked with others, they've asked me about, well, what about dissent early on? And I said, don't even think about dissent early on. Dissent or agreement that's entirely the wrong frame for this. In the sport of javelin throwing, we don't award points for courtesy. I mean, it's just not a thing, right? We're not interested in dissent or agreement early on. We're looking for more ideas, right? And so being aware of that and not trying to, as a leader in an organization, really making it clear that you're not looking, to put your stamp on things prematurely. You're not looking to sway where things are going prematurely. As a follower, not being overly beholden to what you think the leader, wants to throw into the mix prematurely, but really having this openness. And, it's back to the Linus Pauling quote. The best way to get good ideas is first to get lots of ideas.
Yeah.
If there's too much concern about agreement and everyone towing the party line early on, your breadth of ideas is going to be, about 3 inches wide.
Yeah, that would be our academic institutions. A lot of them are liberal arts institutions.
And you don't want that. You don't want 3 inches wide. You want several yards wide. And that's really where you need to go.
One of the things, I think Maria Callas, the great diva, the opera diva, she said something to the effect of, art disturbs, art is domination. In other words, this is how it goes. I'm going to disturb the notion of what you think is acceptable or what you think is art or whatever it is, and I'm going to try to shake you up. And that's because it's original, because I'm doing something you haven't seen before, and you might go into confirmation bias, or you might go into negativity bias, or whatever you do. That's when you're probably doing your job. When there's a certain section of the population that goes, I don't approve. This is no good. I don't like this. Well, look at what rock and roll did. Look at what Elvis did with his hips, and look at what all the great blues, the black blues musicians did, even jazz musicians. It was always suspect. It was always like, hey, you guys smoke reefer, and what's with that horn you're playing? These slick, shady black guys with their, this is what happened. But thank God.
Well, this is where you can choose, though, in your response. There are two words they're so similar, but they're actual opposites. And we talked a lot about reflexive responses, and what we want more from people, from any stimulus, is reflective responses, and to actually reflect on anything you're seeing. So if there is a provocative art, great. Maybe you almost maybe can't help but feel the shock. But then what's your next move? Is it just to be reflexive and then just kind of lash out at it? Or is it to be reflective and go, wow, why did I just have that response? Or what could this open up for me if I now take a moment with it and see where that could go?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. What can this open up in me? Because you need that more than ever as you get older. See, when you're younger, you like counterculture. When you're younger, you like it being shaken up. And somehow as we get older and we have more to lose and stuff, we look at that stuff with a real, I have a natural negative reaction to Kanye West. I don't like the way he wears his hair. I don't like the way he talks. Well, I went and listened to that dude, and I really spent 2 days listening to everything Kanye West has ever done, and also kind of reading about the good, fair critique on him. And then I listened to some interviews. Guy's got something to say. It opened up in me. I went, that guy never stops innovating. Now sometimes it falls flat, but that guy never stops innovating, and he never stops taken on that challenge. Whether or not the music resonates with me is a different story. But the point is that I have to fight that all the time. As I get older, I'm like, no, I know what I like, and I have a criteria for good art, and I'm afraid you don't make it, sir. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ignore you for the rest of your life. No, what you have to do is kind of, if it bothers me, something's probably going on there. I should probably look into it. Some of it's shit. I don't have to like the Kardashians, but But
I think that's fair.
Yeah. No, but there is at the same time, this can't get in the way of your critical thinking. But you talk about that too.
Yeah. Well, again, we're not saying don't think critically, just have more tools in your toolkit. And so even thinking so a lot of this is when and where, right? So when am I critically thinking? Where in the process, when, how am I using those tools? Can I add to that toolkit? Am I using those critical thinking tools prematurely? And that's what we see too often. There's this rush to solution, which we understand because certainly in business, there's this idea that real world adults want to get to the answer, And in doing so, they leave so much value on the table because the answer looks shockingly like everything that's already out there. And then what the research shows is that what we're really striving for is the deft interweaving of uniqueness and relevance. And if you solve for uniqueness first, then you can beef up relevance. That's easy.
So maybe a better way of saying is what's right about this idea? What's right about this first before what's wrong about it?
Yeah. But if your focus is only on relevance just looks an awful lot like what's already out there. And in a very competitive landscape, what's already out there isn't going to take you very far. And what's already out there doesn't give you much of a profit margin because there's no reason for people to choose you. And there's no premium pricing. You just have to support whatever you're doing with so much, advertising, promotion, hustle, everything that you really can't make a business around it. Or even as a comedian, I mean, you know this. How many people throughout your career have you seen that may have shown some promise early on, but they chose an easier route that was too much like everything else that was going on.
Yeah.
And then
I was saying that the other day is like, I saw a guy, I stuck my head in the OR, the original room at the Comedy Store, and a guy was on there, and I said, I got to get out of here. And my friend said, you didn't even hear him say anything. I go, I know, but I can just hear the rhythm. I could hear how that like there was a rhythm and the music to it. Like it's all a song. Yeah. And I listened to it 3 seconds, and I knew who all his influences were, and I knew what his jokes were going to be. I was like, I can't. In other words, it's derivative. I got to get the hell out of here, and it hurts my ears. It's just from being around a long time.
All the hits, all the time.
That's it.
And also, I mean, in terms of that uniqueness, it's also this podcast. Like, we spent a long time trying to figure out what the fuck this podcast is, right? I mean, it was Man Thoughts, it was the Brian Callen Show, it was the Brian Callen Show with Hunter Motz, and now it's Mixed Mental Arts. And then even with that, we were like, okay, we named it this cool name, Mixed Mental Arts. What does that actually mean? And so then the belt system has come out of that. And, it has been this sort of like really trying to figure out what are we doing that's different from everyone else, because there are plenty of shows where people, endlessly interview a stream of people. And I always keep thinking of the George Bernard Shaw quote that you could take all the economists and lay them end to end, and they would never reach a conclusion. And that's how I feel when I listen to like most academics or most like Charlie Rose or Larry King. It's just like, okay, here's another person with some thoughts. Here's another person with some thoughts, and it never builds to a world
Jonathan
view.
Jonathan Haidt quoted John Stuart Mill in a speech he made, which was, if all you are interested in is your side of the story, you won't understand even that, right? Is that it? What is it?
So as he wrote, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion.
He who only knows his side of the case knows little of that.
Thanks, Reed Nice Wonder.
There he is. He who knows, and it's a really great way to look at, and we have to remind ourselves of that. It's really easy to kind of.
And I think that's what's interesting about, like, as you start to look around what's going on in a lot of these cultures around the world, whether it's Islam or social justice warriors or, these sort of alt-right extreme conservatives or any of these groups, or even a lot of people with science, they sort of understand this very superficial version of what their culture is about, and they don't really understand the deep principles and what it's really saying about human nature or what it really requires of you. Walid, who does Greed for Ilm, he said that apparently in the Quran there is this phrase that there will come a time when people will only know Islam to their throats. And that is where a lot of the world's cultures are now. People only know it at this level. It hasn't sort of penetrated into their deep thinking and how they view the world. They just are paying lip service to these ideas. And that's the problem of cultures, is it becomes so easy to essentially virtue signal, where you're like, look at me, I'm a good social justice warrior, I'm a good Muslim, I'm a good this, because I say all the right things.
Or also, and again, I'm in the middle of reading Harari's book, so Sapiens, and he kind of touches on the fact that we also have this rulers. I mean, if you think about how superstitious people were. So if you were the emperor of China, or for that matter, if you were leading the communist revolution, or for that matter, if you were one of the founding fathers, you feel incredibly fortunate to be in a position where you have access to a certain knowledge, or certainly, or you are the leader of a great civilization. And there's a human tendency to want to kind of take the people that don't have your civilization, those poor, dusty barbarians in the hinterlands, and convert them, bring your culture to them. Now, sometimes that requires, unfortunately, killing all the men over 14 because they've got swords and they're just already unruly. But you know what I'm saying? So assimilating these cultures, that is empire. empire is what that is based on. It wasn't just this sort of sociopathic idea of like taking land for the Romans were, yes, they created a wasteland and called it peace, but the Romans truly believed, at least the elite, and it was a superstition, it was an ideology, it was a religion, that there was something to that they had to Hellenize the world, that they had to bring the Greeks to the education, Aristotle and Socrates, they had to bring civilization to these barbarians everywhere. That was a mission, and it exists today in our foreign policy. Think about what Iraq was really about. Think about what these things are about. It wasn't just about weapons of mass destruction. It was the idea that we can restructure those barbarians over there in the Middle East, that we can bring our values, because their philosophy is rooted in hate and falsehood, and ours is rooted in truth and love. I mean,
Brian, more music. We need more music.
More music, everyone. I need trumpets.
But I think the other thing to recognize as well is that often when you really, like, the reason why Haidt's happiness hypothesis was so important for me is that we can so often be saying the same thing with different words and not realize that we're saying the same thing. So, what is the functional difference between what Muhammad is saying when they will only know Islam to their throats and the sort of Christian idea of lip service? Yeah. They're the same idea, and they're just expressed in slightly different ways.
We're doing that in the world. I mean, liberal Western values have permeated everywhere. I mean, you're not really hearing you're not even hearing ISIS really. I mean, let's take extreme examples. You're not even hearing them say necessarily that there's a caste system that we should all adhere to and that we should be king and all of you should be slaves. In fact, most of us on both sides of the political spectrum, the conservative, let's just take right and left in this country, we're kind of saying the same thing in terms of, if you were to say to a conservative, well, you don't believe in equality. And they would say, I do believe in equality. I believe in equality of opportunity. I just don't believe in enforcing equality of outcome. And then liberals would have a different rebuttal to that. But you're right. When we are many times saying the same thing using different words and trying to arrive at the same issue with different methodology. That seems to be the fight.
Well, and even words like capitalism, that's sort of, I think, been one of the amazing things is just the degree to which capitalism means so many different things to people. And so when you use a word like capitalism or democracy or really any phrase that you think that you're on the same page, but you just haven't cleared up those fundamental definitions. Or my all-time favorite, the word reason, which means totally different things to different people. To some people, reason means I'm an objective person and I see things as they are, but all those other idiots, right, are blinded by their ideology and all of that. Or some people understand reason in the way that Ben Franklin did, where it is this reflective, slow-thinking capacity and the ability to sort of recognize that your feelings are driving your thinking and then be like, okay, what is the story that best fits reality, best fits all the available data? So much of, I think, our job here is to help people understand how their brains actually work. And then a lot of it is also just clearing up the definitions of words. What do we really mean when we're saying capitalism? What do we really mean when we're saying libertarian? Because that also means a whole bunch of different things to people.
Sure.
Yeah. So much of this does get back to the title of Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And the cognitive biases are seated in fast thinking, right? Because it's reflexive. It's just there. It's our kind of inheritance from thousands of generations and everything. It's automatic. And it's just this notion that one of my colleagues just says, man, we're just on rails, and we are until the point that we decide not to be. And that's what's so important there. And being a little more reflective instead of reflexive is what we're just trying to encourage. Now, we have to be reflexive on much of what we do, because a lot of the daily tasks that we're engaged in honestly don't require a whole lot of high-level thinking. And we don't want them to, because high-level thinking is hard, and it's cognitively expensive. It takes time. we want to conserve our energy for those things that matter most. But I think it's fair to say that we could all be doing more of it. And so that's what we're trying to encourage here. Just being aware of what's going on so that we can be choosy and then say, hey, I'm going to take a moment here and try something different.
I think the other thing that's really important as well about Adam's experience is, and this is something that I've only come to realize in terms of sort of the what is your availability and what is the sort of the Dunning-Kruger of it all, is that you've seen 200 different companies. And if you've seen 200 different versions, then you're able to spot the patterns. Whereas most people have only seen one. And I notice this all the time in tutoring, where most parents, they only really have one experience of one family. They only really know what happens in their house. And then, you know, the Joneses are doing such an amazing job of presenting this, you know, perfect idyllic view to the world. And when you've been inside, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of houses, you know, you understand, oh, what's going on here is actually quite normal and ordinary, and the solutions are quite simple and not that hard. But when you only have that one example, you're like, man, everything is so screwed here. We are the worst family. You know, our children are the most dysfunctional. And so I think that's also an important thing about your experience. And why does Adam see these patterns? Why does Adam understand these patterns? Because he's had the privilege of seeing lots and lots of different examples.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, thank God. The book is Outsmart Your Instincts. And Adam Hansen is the writer. Get it or die.
Because Adam Hansen is really the premier idea sexologist on the planet.
Yes. So good, though. Yeah, so good. And we really, really love having people like you part of this community, man. It makes a big difference. It's very flattering and humbling, and it's awesome.
Well, it's your face, Brian. It's kind of inspirational.
I know, my jawline. It's great. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. I love talking about this stuff. It matters.
It really does matter. And the book is something to have on hand all the time. It's great. So, and there's more to it. I don't want to give it all away, but there's more to it. There's still more to talk about in the book. But
and also, Adam is a regular in the Mixed Mental Arts Facebook group. So if you want to learn idea sex from the Casanova of idea sex, the master, the Barry White of idea sex, you can meet him at the Mixed Mental Arts Facebook group.
Awesome. Adam, thank you. And thank you for that Native American backdrop behind you. Yeah, it really...
It's Mount Imbabura.
Yeah, of course it is.
Lived there for about 6 months. It's Otavalo, Ecuador.
Oh, it's in Ecuador. There you go. Well, that's
and
it's very, very liberal of you. We appreciate that.
Well, here's an interesting thing about Adam's backstory. What community do you think he was a part of in Idaho?
The Seventh-day Adventists.
No.
I don't know.
Adam, do you want to share?
I hope it's a sex cult.
Well, what's the so southeastern Idaho is just north of one other state. And then why might a young man in his late teens, early 20s have spent time in Ecuador?
Oh, well, obviously you're into ayahuasca or something, right?
No, it's where I served my Mormon mission.
Oh, no kidding. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Back then.
That's
long story. Hunter can fill you in.
Amazing.
Yeah. But in terms of a person who understands conformity bias, and who, you know, when you are an innovator and you want to innovate, you understand the importance of culture pretty profoundly. And I think that the other thing that's interesting about conformity bias is that it also makes it clear why so many innovators are outsiders in some sense. Like I list this book, The Geography of Genius, which is about golden ages, and they talk about Vienna and the fact that so many of the innovators were Jews because they're outsiders and they have the benefit of not necessarily feeling that conformity bias in the same way and can ask more fundamental questions than people who are just fitting into the status quo there.
The point is, if you see a Jew or a Mormon, thank him, ladies and gentlemen. Thank him.
There was a giant spider on you, Brian.
I felt it.
And also subscribe to the YouTube channel, join the Mixed Mental Arts Facebook group. There's lots and lots of ways to get involved in the community, and you can meet amazing people like Adam Hansen. and Idea Sex is the brown belt, just so that everybody knows. So when we roll that out, we happen to have in the dojo the best sensei in the world for helping you acquire your brown belt. And then the other thing too is Adam is going to be starting an Outsmart Your Instincts podcast.
Excellent.
So
excellent. I'll be a listener.
Lots and lots of opportunity to learn.
Yeah,
from
well,
the
you'll
master.
come back on and we'll talk more.
Yep.
It's great, man. We appreciate it. Thanks so much for your time, brother.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. This is more fun than I could have hoped for.
We like it.
Thanks, Adam.
All right, buddy. See you later. Good stuff.
Ciao, ciao.